Two readings from God's Word. The first, an Old Testament reading, just two short verses. This from Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22 and 23. This is from the book of the law. Moses is reminding God's people of the perfect standards of God's law and the penalty and the curse of disobeying it. And in part, this is what he says. If a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day, for a hanged man is cursed by God. You shall not defile your land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. That's important context for what we're going to be studying this morning and what we're going to continue to be looking at following the celebration of Good Friday and Easter last week. We're going to be returning in our spring sermon series to the book of 1 Corinthians. I say returning because back in 2019, we started studying 1 Corinthians, looking at chapter 1, and year by year we have made our way back there and have progressively worked our way through the letter. And now as we pick it back up, we're going to conclude this spring by looking at chapters 15 and 16. And in those chapters, particularly chapter 15, Paul ends his letter to this very troubled church with explaining an extended discussion of the most important foundation for Christianity, and that is the historical, victorious resurrection of Jesus from the dead. The perfect topic for us to focus on following Easter. Now, to kick that off, we're going to go back and we're going to do a little Good Friday work again today before we look at Paul's ending of the letter with the resurrection. We're going to look at his beginning of the letter in chapter 1, specifically verses 18 to 25, because in this text, Paul sets the scene for the importance and the crucial place of the crucifixion of Jesus. And particularly for us, it's an important place to start because if we're going to understand the resurrection, then we need to understand the need for the crucifixion. So if you're able, as I read this portion of God's Word, let me invite you to stand. We do this as a sign of respect for God's Word. And then when I'm done reading, I'm going to make the declaration that this is the Word of the Lord and invite you to respond by saying, "Thanks be to God." 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 to 25. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. This is the word of the Lord. Please be seated. Looking back on his life, Mark Twain once made the comment, I was young and foolish back then, now I am old and foolisher. Now he, of course, was making fun. Foolisher is not a word, but if at least in the eyes of some people, we tend to embrace foolishness more as we age. Well, one of the most foolish beliefs of Christianity, many people historically would say, is that it's based on a scandalous public execution of its founder. Somehow doesn't seem right, seems foolish. That somehow this apparent foolishness of the execution of Jesus on a Roman cross is the means of our salvation. It seems foolish. It seems worse than that, scandalous. And that's really what I want to look at this morning. How is that so? Why is the cross foolish, and why at the same time is the cross so important? I want to walk through that progressively with what we just read. First, looking at how the cross is foolish and how the cross is even more than that, scandalous, but finally how the cross is essential. So first, in what way can we say that the cross is foolish? Well, as Christians, I think we're sometimes too quick to get defensive when someone challenges what we believe. I'm not accusing, I do it too. In fact, I remember a conversation I once had with someone about the simple storyline of the gospel with another Christian. We talked and I summarized it, and she actually summarized it back, and she made an important observation. She said, when I say it like that, it really does sound a little bit unbelievable, doesn't it? And she was right. Right? Because all I said was that the gospel is about this, invisible, all-powerful being who created us and everything. That we had rebelled against this all-powerful, invisible being who created everything. That God then became, in the person of this man Jesus, incarnate to come to earth, to live as a human being about 2,000 years ago in a small province of the Roman Empire. That he lived a perfect life, that he died a sacrificial death, and that he rose again from the dead, and that all we need to do is to put our faith and our trust in this God who became a person, who died and rose again from the dead, and represents for us a way to get back into a relationship with this invisible, all-powerful God who created everything. That's all I said. And that's not exhaustive, but it's true. But even when you say it like that, it does sound a little bit unbelievable, doesn't it? I want to acknowledge that. Paul acknowledges that. He makes it clear in verse 18 and again in verse 23 that if you do not see things from God's perspective, if you don't have eyes to see the cross in that way, it's going to sound a little bit foolish. And there are, I think, a few reasons why the cross would seem foolish to us. What are they? Well, subpoints now. The cross is foolish because we actually want strength, not weakness. And the cross is weak. Right, we want power, at least power as the way the world would understand it. Think about it. What kind of power would have been respected in Corinth? Well, military power, of course. It was a Roman city, protected by the Roman Empire and the Roman legions. Political power, right? It was far from perfect, but Rome actually, more than most civilizations of the time, had established a legal system, stable government. Economic power would have been valued. Corinth was a center of commerce and trade. Philosophical power, the power of the mind, the scribe, the debater of verse 20 that Paul mentions. Corinth was a leading cultural center as well, where the people of the age debated the issues of the day. Now, military, political, economic, the intellectuals, America is not actually much different in the way that we understand power and importance, and death on a cross is not powerful in any of those ways. All right, think about this. It was used by the Romans to execute leaders of rebellions. And therefore, it was intentionally designed to drive home to those who might have ideas of challenging power that they really didn't have any. And so if you think about Jesus on the cross, and well, he's supposed to be God, and there he is, and well, it seems pretty weak. Doesn't seem very powerful. And we say we want strength. So in that measure, at least, it would seem relatively foolish if we look at it that way. We also want more. We always want more. Paul says, verse 22, that Jews demand signs. Right? Throughout Jesus' ministry, this was a common theme. The followers of Jesus, they liked the miracles he did, but it was the opponents of Jesus who actually demanded the miracles. And it was never enough. It would have never been enough. Even Jesus' resurrection to those who opposed him wouldn't be enough to prove the truth of the cross. It's the same for us. To those who aren't coming from a Christian perspective, to those who wouldn't grant the premise of a God with absolute authority and right to reveal himself as he pleases, this does sound a little bit far-fetched. We want more. We say we want more. I want more evidence. I want more signs. I want something more, because we're used to our requests being granted on demand, and it's puzzling or foolish if we think about it that way, that God wouldn't just grant us a simple request of giving us a sign, a little handwritten note laid down on our pillow or something like that. Can't he just do this one little thing? That's what our mind would say. That's point number one. We acknowledge that the cross seems foolish to those without eyes to see. Now, point number two, that we also need to see that the cross is even more than foolish. It's scandalous. There's some overlap here, but scandal takes things a step further. The cross goes beyond mere folly. Verse 23, Paul says a crucified Messiah is a stumbling block. And I think it's safe to say that when he's talking about stumbling block here, it's more than just something you trip over and it's like, oops, didn't know that was there. No, what the word carries, the idea of the word, the meaning of the word, is it carries something that either leads you into sin or something that is offensive, morally offensive, a stumbling block. In fact, Paul uses the same word in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 11, and there it's often translated as offense, the offense of the cross, the stumbling block of the cross. That's what he says in Galatians 5. Now, why? Why is the cross so offensive? Well, as we often point out around Good Friday, there's something profoundly morally offensive to the Jewish mind about the Messiah being crucified. That's why I read you that passage from Deuteronomy. right? There's a connection between the offense of hanging on a tree, the curse that represents. Now, it would also have been significantly offensive to Greco-Roman sensibilities as well. Dying on a cross lacks dignity. Roman citizens weren't crucified because it was that horrific. It was that much of a loss of dignity. It was offensive to be crucified. Now, there's also a more serious charge sometimes that's made about the cross, a more serious offense that sometimes people take from it, and that's that people look at it and they find somehow in the cross some sort of example of what people would call cosmic child abuse. How dare God do this, the Father, to his Son? And the argument goes like this: what kind of religion would make it necessary for a father to have his son mocked, tortured, and gruesomely killed in order to let people get into heaven? Right? What kind of a moral monster would do something like that? That's how the argument would go, and people would say that's offensive to me. And some of you might ask, are people really saying that? And the answer is yes, people do really say that. I've had conversations with people along those exact lines. And when you put it like that, right, you might say, well, that sounds pretty offensive. And it sounds even more serious in these modern times because of the hypersensitivity that we have appropriately about abuse of any kind, particularly towards children. And it does come down to a very real, serious discussion about the purpose of the cross. What is happening there? Because while Paul does remind us to see that those coming from a different perspective will understand the cross to be foolish, they'll see it as offensive, never does it give us ground about whether the cross is necessary or not. And that's the last point. We need to understand the necessity of the cross and what it's actually doing, because when we do that, we see the cross then not as an act of abuse, but an ultimate act of love. This is the last point. The cross is essential. You can't get around it. Paul's saying that the message of the cross is central to what he's doing. Verse 23, we preach Christ crucified. In other words, this is Christianity. So if it offends you, well, then there is something about Christianity in total. You can't just say, well, I like Jesus and I like Christianity, but the cross, let's just put that over here. That bothers me. You can't, Paul says, because this is the essence and the centrality of the Christian message. Christ crucified. And that's why it appears so foolish at first. It's why it appears so scandalous. But we must make sure that it's not understood. And there's a number of things that we need to understand if we're going to see it as essential. You ready? Here we go. These are the subpoints under that third point. Right? Why is the cross essential? Well, the cross was willingly endured. This is the way that we get around and answer that argument about God being a cosmic child abuser. The cross was Jesus' plan too. He's not a helpless actor in this. He's no victim. He's the Father's equal. And as God himself retained authority over his own death, he willingly went to the cross. In John 10, Jesus addresses it directly. He says, "No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up." Paul says later in his letter to the Ephesians, Jesus delivered himself as an offering and a sacrifice. The cross was not abuse. The cross was willing sacrifice, an act of love. Now, second, if the cross is a willing self-sacrifice of the Son of God, then we need to see the cross as essential because it's the cross that solves our problem. Paul calls the word of the cross in verse 18 the power of God for those who are being saved. Right? I don't know if you've seen them or whatever. In one of the Marvel Iron Man movies, one of these, the Iron Man movies that Marvel made. Right? Iron Man, because he's a superhero, he's saving the world, and he's establishing peace by his power. And just about everyone is loving Iron Man, which infuriates the guy who's the bad guy in this movie. And he has a grudge against Iron Man. And at one point, Iron Man actually asks him, like, "Why are you doing this? Right? Why do you hate me? Like, what's going on?" And he says, "I'm doing this, I'm attacking you, because if you could make God bleed, people would cease to believe in him." He wanted to hurt the superhero, because if you could hurt the superhero who was the God to everyone, the hero of everyone, right, then people would cease to believe in him. If you could make God bleed, people would cease to believe in him. Well, isn't that interesting? And if for our salvation we needed a God who didn't bleed, then that might be true for us as well. But the problem humanity faces is that blood is required. It is required for our salvation. Our blood, that's who deserves to die, we do. But the cross is where that is completely reversed. It's where, like Paul says in verse 25, the foolishness of God is stronger than men. It's where God says, I will bleed, and I will bleed for you. The Jewish leaders were right to observe that anyone who hung on a tree was cursed by God, but they were wrong in not understanding that they needed a Messiah who would assume that curse for them. Yes, Jesus was cursed, not because of anything that he had done, but in being crucified, he assumed the identity of a morally offensive criminal. He was cursed. They made God bleed, but his blood is what makes atonement for you, and his curse is what makes us blessed. Now, if that's true, if the cross solves our problem, then we have to see that the cross is absolutely astonishing. Right? It's not wrong to find the claims of the cross, like the God who created the universe becoming a man who dies a sacrificial death. It's not wrong to say in one sense that that's unbelievable, but we mean it in a very different way. Right? We use that word all the time. We have a great meal and we kind of say, how was it? It was unbelievable. It doesn't mean that like you can't believe that I had a really good meal. It means that it's astonishing. It was awesome. And that's how we have to take and understand that word. We need to understand the cross as unbelievable in that sense. It is absolutely astonishing that the God of the universe would come in human person to solve what is our problem by willingly dying on our behalf. The cross is true. And because it's true, that fact that the Son of God should die a seemingly foolish and scandalous death for me and for you, that is astonishing. Now, the last thing, we have to see that the cross then is also a sifter, a sorter, if you will. What do I mean? Well, I mean that because it's so seemingly foolish and because it causes men to stumble, that the cross is naturally going to divide people at this point. You're going to have to figure out which side you're on. The cross kind of lands right in the middle of our hearts and says, which side will you be on? And Paul makes the contrast here, verse 18, between those who are perishing and those who are being saved. The cross is the demarking line. Is the cross folly or is it power? The cross falls right in the middle and begs you, commands you to choose. Are you going to choose wisdom and discernment, verse 20, according to the world's definition? Or are you going to choose it by God's definition? In other words, the cross forces the issue. What do you think? What do you believe? So we're thinking about it, because the implications are absolutely massive. They're massive for our eternal destiny. Paul talks about it being the difference between perishing and being saved. There can be no greater issue of importance than that. But it also has implications, significant implications, even as we just think about it for the church, for the unity of the church, for how we exist as the church. Because the cross, if we really apply it, completely eliminates pride amongst us, doesn't it? If you actually understand, you actually believe the message of the cross, then you have no room to think that you're fundamentally better than anyone else. Right? Do you know how far that one truth can go in fighting disunity amongst us? It's huge. The cross completely eliminates any ground for you to look at another person and think that you're better than they are. Because that cross, that death on the cross, was equally needed for you as it was for them. The cross eliminates pride. It gives all those who have experienced its power, it gives them a common experience and completely overshadows any other difference. I was talking to a Wall police officer this week in our parking lot earlier this week. Some of you know him. Every year he travels to France with veterans of World War II to mark the anniversary of D-Day. And every year, as the generation ages, there are fewer and fewer. But this year, the 82nd anniversary of the Normandy invasion, there are 30 veterans in the trip that he is participating in. 30 veterans who are going, one of whom is a June 6th D-Day veteran. He's 103 years old. And while there's fewer and fewer of them every year, I went back and I looked and I remembered just a couple of years ago, 5 years ago, at an anniversary when men were going. And some of these guys had gone every single year. One of them had gone for 30 years in a row. Right? And one of them, they asked, like, why do you go year after year? And he said, I can't go. I can't not go. I can't not go. Right? We go over there and when we be with, and I'm with the others, we share this experience together, all these guys. Now, let me ask you a question. What builds that kind of bond with someone else? All right, this was a day more than 80 years ago. All right, there have been more than 30,000 days since that day. What did the shared bond of men who gathered every year with other men. Where does that come from? And why does it supersede every other difference that these men might have? Well, I've never read of, or I've never seen an interview with someone who jumped off a landing craft, who experienced the battle of combat in that day, who believed that they survived because of anything they did or deserved. And when they gather on those beaches, they gather to celebrate a gift that they were given on that tragic day that they didn't deserve in the presence of others who share as recipients of that same gift. Now, the analogy isn't perfect, but do you see? Christians, when we understand the cross, then every time we gather should be just like that. We are recipients of a gift of survival that we did not deserve. We have escaped death, not because we earned it, not because we were smarter, not because we could dodge the bullets and our brother next to us couldn't, but because of the grace of God and the grace of God alone. Did you hear what that veteran said? Right? It should make our aches and pains seem pretty petty about why we can't make it to worship, on a weekly basis. He was 95 years old. He was still going back to France every year, and he said, I can't not go. When we gather as a church, do we have that kind of mindset? I can't not go to celebrate with those who have shared this experience of survival with me. We are survivors who on that tragic day when Jesus died on the cross were given a gift that we didn't deserve. And now we're able to live to remember that day of liberation and to tell others all about it. D-Day may have been the largest amphibious military operation in the history of the world, but the cross is the most gigantic and most heroic rescue mission that's ever been accomplished. It may seem foolish. It may even seem scandalous, but when you understand it, the cross is absolutely astonishing. Let's pray.